I hope we use more. It's funny, growing up, I always said this is one that I always heard from teachers, parents. Rash, I agree with Alex. Okay, more. Fantastic. Okay, let's turn to question 2. Let me just stop the poll for this one. And question 2 says, individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style. So for example, visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learners. And if you teach to those particular styles, students will learn better. Right? So one person says that is true, one person says that is false. Rash, do you want to go ahead and input an answer as well? Or the chat box. You can also use the microphone at any point in this presentation. Okay, so 2 for yes and 1 for no. Thank you. And number 3, talk about the left brain, right brain dichotomy. So for question 3, differences in hemispheric dominance, left brain, right brain, can help explain differences among learners. All right, so I have 2 say that's true and 1 say that's false. I have to say you might hear my 9-month-old in the background. I'm sorry, I can't do anything about that. Right. I will come back to those 3 questions. Thank you for answering those. And I'd just like to turn our attention to what are the particular factors that cause neuromyths to be so pervasive. The term neuromyths, interestingly enough, I just found out today, was coined in the 1980s at a time when an attempt was being made to apply these concepts to teaching and learning practice. So I think that speaks to the complexity of these concepts. The questions that I posed to you have been taken from the research of Paul Howard-Jones, who was a teacher turned researcher. He currently works at the University of Bristol. And he's done a lot of work in connecting the learning sciences with teaching practice. These 3 statements were taken directly from his research paper. I can share that with you. I think there's about 10 statements that he offered teachers from around the world. And you'll see in the table that a large percentage of teachers believe in the 10% brain myth, and even larger numbers believe in learning styles and the left-right brain dichotomy. All of the questions I posed to you are in fact false. And the data is similar for teachers based in Europe and China as well. I think learning styles is the most pervasive myth that I've seen. Let's pause here to take stock of this a little bit. Using the chat box function or your microphone, please share with us some of the learning myths that you might have come across in your career, whether as a student or an instructor or just in your workplace in general. Have you heard of these statements before, and why do you feel like they're so attractive? So feel free to turn your mic on, raise your hand, or use the chat box. And especially if you said true, I've heard the learning styles one a lot. Yes, exactly. It's very, very popular. Are there any others that you perhaps have heard of that are not on the list that I've heard?
I've heard the one that sort of younger learners or sort of more current generations have lower attention spans.
Mm-hmm.
But then I haven't waded into the research, but I've heard that the particular study that did that was fairly methodologically flawed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that one, I'm not sure if it's a myth or not, but I think it might be a good candidate for a possible neuromyth.
Absolutely. There's so much research that sort of tries to give an estimate about our attention spans as well. Some say it's only 9 seconds and 18 seconds, and you'll see all sorts of papers. But you're right, looking at the methods of these papers, there's definitely some flaws and some gaps. Rash says, when it comes to learning, metacognition, thinking about thinking, can be just as important as intelligence. Yeah, absolutely. And also the way we look at intelligence in education is quite a narrow view in itself. So thanks for bringing that point up. Are there any other myths that you've heard of? Is anyone surprised by the numbers that they see? The 93%, the 91%?
I think I found the left brain, right brain one fairly surprising, because I think the learning styles is very focused on education, but the left brain, right brain shows up everywhere in terms of people's personal assessments of themselves, people's sort of explanation of other people in non-educational contexts. Like, it's extremely pervasive.
Yep. And you'll see all the graphics with part of the brain, those lovely colorful images, and the other part sort of the analytical. You'll see that graphic so everywhere. So you're right, it is quite pervasive. But yeah, do dive into that paper. I highly recommend it, and I think it should be attached to the Padlet. So thinking of the reasons why these myths might be so popular, I've offered part of a graphic created by researcher Tracey at Tokuhama, Espinosa. I've selected two of the reasons why, but her graphic has other things such as commercial benefits. So companies trying to sell educational institutional products will sort of simplify their research in order to make it sound appealing. And also our need for simplicity sort of demands that sort of information. But other key contributors to the popularity of neuromyths are in graphic. Our need for simplicity can also explain why the popular press might overgeneralize research findings. We know that context plays such an important role in translating research to practice, yet it is often overlooked in research. So research is often taken at face value rather than considered as a guideline for careful use in different contexts. And this also relates to the next point. Research might be true in a controlled environment, such as the lab, but perhaps not so true in the classroom. This is why particular action research or that you do as a practitioner, or fields like the scholarship of teaching and learning that Dr. Eaton mentioned today in her keynote, are important emerging conversations in championing context and inquiry-based research in educational settings, because we're finding that we can't always translate learning sciences research into education without focusing on context. Scientific illiteracy is also another important factor, which is applicable in many settings. Trying to source open access, high quality, jargon-free research is sometimes really difficult. I'm currently doing some research in this area myself with K-12 teachers, and most teachers will say that despite being interested in the evidence, research is so hard to access, it's hard to understand when they do get access to it. And it's time consuming to read, and they just do not have that capacity to focus on it. And these factors might cause us to make incorrect assertions in a hurry, or go to these popular sort of overgeneralized findings that exist in the media as well. So I will put Tracey Espinosa's full graphic on the Padlet as well, but let's move on to how we can apply the research in the science of learning to our practice. So this is Willingham's simple memory model. This model makes quite a few assumptions, but I've used it as a jumping off point for talking about the next part of our presentation. And the assumption this model is making is that learning involves remembering, which is fair. And remembering uses working memory and long-term memory structures in the brain, particularly the movement of information between these two structures. So we learn something new and we strengthen that memory by remembering it, and so on. And it's in that repetitive action that we can say that we have learned something. And without that dance between long-term and working memory, we might simply forget the information that we have been exposed to. So as I said, I've used this model as a jumping off point. We will focus on just 3 aspects of teaching and learning labeled on the model in red. When we talk about active learning, consider what aspects of a student's environment you'd like to focus on. And also bearing attention to the fact that in an online context, students might have many distractions that we are not aware of. So design instruction around 1 or 2 particular key areas, trying to minimize distractions as much as possible. Metacognition, or thinking about thinking, should focus on the process of learning rather than products or outcomes. Really ask students to pay attention, give them the time and space to think about the process, making it as explicit as possible for students and prompting them to think about the how and why questions as they work through course materials. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you might do that a little bit later on. One key part is reflection. Reflection is an integral part of this process. Finally, when we talk about formative assessment, do take a look at one of the links that I've posted. They might help you for your micro-teaching tomorrow as well. Consider how you can encourage students to strengthen their learning using low-stakes assessment strategies that really promote the recall and the remembering and sort of that back and forth between working and long-term memory. All right, so I'd like to pause here and ask you to share any descriptive words that come to mind when you see the words active learning, formative assessment, and metacognition. So take a moment to enter your answers into the chat box or say them out loud. Let me know what specific parts you're referring to as well. So when you think of active learning, what are the words that pop up into your mind, and so on. I'll give you a moment. Engagement, Kazi, is that related to active learning? Interest-driven, knowledge checks, reflection, yep. Thought processes related to metacognition, yep. And Alex, can I just confirm, are you referring to active learning as well?
My first one is for active learning. Second one is for formative, and the third one is for metacognition.
Okay.
Sorry, I jumped the gun with our activity.
Thank you. No, that's great. Thank you so much. Group study, active learning, I think of hands-on, going through, and experience. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your contributions. I think I like them better than my own, but I will share what I was thinking of as well in the next slide. All right, so this is my example. Active learning often evokes the notion of doing something, as you've said, and this can lead to different opinions of what sort of doing is most valuable or meaningful, especially online. This answer will obviously depend on the context you are in and the material that you are teaching. So valuable doing might look different for you teaching one subject as compared to your colleague. Formative assessment needs to be an ongoing conversation between the instructor and the student, or the student and other student. And I'll really invite you to think about the student's role as central to the process of giving feedback. It is also important to consider the student's role, as I've said, in the process and really allowing them to play an active part. And finally, metacognition, thanks for your input about that. Absolutely involves purposeful and diligent planning, acting and reflecting. And in my opinion, this is the most important area that we can guide students in if they are to become strong, self-regulated learners. But often it's the most difficult as well. When you speak to teachers, they will say that students often don't see value in this, and it's hard to structure this. So we'll go through these key areas one by one, and I'll offer a problem and a possible question to think of it. Think of the problem, a way we might think of how to sort of come around it. So students' perceptions in online course engagement reveals that course design doesn't always satisfy their need for cognitive engagement, leading to lower levels of motivation in online courses. And then when you speak to instructors, you'll see that we often misinterpret what we mean by active. So what do we mean by doing? Are we conflating cognitive engagement with simple busy work? Students often report being frustrated by busy work and tick box exercises to measure engagement. And you'll see this in a face-to-face classroom a little bit more. If you walk into a face-to-face classroom and everybody looks busy, you can say that makes the instructor look better, but really what are they busy in is the question that you need to be asking. And I'm sure that's compounded. The complexity of that is definitely compounded in an online setting. So I'm taking cognitive engagement as a measure of active learning. And cognitive engagement includes the amount of effort that a student puts into their work and their level of motivation. And that definition was offered by Richardson and Newby in 2006. Breakout rooms are a simple and easy way to increase the level of student interaction and direct engagement with their peers and course material. So just give me a thumbs up or an emoji if you've used breakout rooms in Collaborate before, and how has that experience been for you? Perfect, great. Thank you, Rash. I've used it myself for tutorials for the fundamentals of online learning course, and it's been great to sort of pop in and out of breakout rooms to hear the level of conversation and come back. Great to hear. Thanks, Irene. In math, oh, fantastic. Kazi, would you mind sharing how you use it in math? That's I wouldn't think of it being used in math, but that's such a great example.
So what I usually do, I tell my students to create their own problem. So I discuss about a problem or a theory, and I said, we know there are a lot of problems in textbook or your online labs, so how you can develop a problem. I figured out when they can write their or create their own problem. Mm-hmm. By reading cases or the problems or the discussion that we had about a topic, then they actually, know better. They learn better than when I give them a problem and then ask them to solve it.
Thank you for sharing that. Absolutely. I was going to say that students might use the breakout rooms as an opportunity to discuss complex course concepts, case studies, as you mentioned, and connect their prior learning and experiences to new material. So offering that time and space to do so is really engaging in my experience as well. I also encourage you to look at Adobe Spark. You might ask students to create a summary page with different topics, short learning videos and graphics. These are all ways in which you can encourage and engage students with their learning. Although please do ensure that the work is purposeful and not just something that will keep them busy, as we mentioned. Another way is offering students a choice of how they would like to represent their learning. This can also enhance motivation for learning and therefore enhance engagement. So again, just give me a thumbs up or some sort of indication if you've used Adobe Spark before. And if not, it might be a great time for you to try in your microteaching tomorrow. Rash, would you like to share how exactly you've used it and what features used? Alex has used it, Kazi has used it, great. I think, Kazi, you've used it in a microteaching before with me previously as well, and it works really well. Okay, so we'll move on. As for independent learning, so this is the unfacilitated part, you might want to dedicate a discussion board to useful learning strategies, sharing research, connecting ideas, and peer engagement, and just let students use it as they will. Also, a more personal form of active learning is encouraging students to write in reflective journals about what they are learning, what they would like to know, and leave it up to them whether they want to share this or not with you or their peers. But really, the idea is to make engagement a central part of teaching and learning. So Rash says, I've used Adobe Spark for demonstrations and casework during an online course. No problem. That's great. Thank you for sharing that example with us. All right, moving on to formative assessment. We often give feedback to students with little consideration of what comes next. So formative assessment practices consider students as the recipients of information and not as active key players in receiving that information and having a dialogue back and forth. So for example, thinking about what are students expected to do with the feedback and the comments that they receive? Do they have the skills to respond to feedback in a way that will improve their learning? How are we considering the student's role when providing feedback? And a question we might ask over here on the slide is, how might we develop a feedback literacy model which considers students as partners? I'd love to hear how you give feedback in your online or offline classrooms as well as we go through this. So this figure is not mine. It was developed by David Carles and his colleagues in 2018, and it provides features of student feedback literacy. So ultimately, if you look at the bottom half of this graphic, we want students to take action with regards to the feedback that they are given. And to do this, they must appreciate the feedback, learn how to make judgments about the comments that they will receive, and manage their emotions, which form a big part of receiving feedback about the work that is posed to them. Students have invested a lot in the work that they deliver, or at least we assume that they have, and receiving feedback, especially if it's not something that they expect, can bring up all sorts of emotions. So you'll see these 3 question marks on the slide here, and I'd like you to consider and share how we might facilitate the processes that they point to. So what can we as instructors do to help students ultimately take action with the feedback they receive? Take a moment to input your answers into the chat box. How can we help them appreciate the feedback? How can we guide them in making judgments and managing the affect or their emotions surrounding it? Please do use the mic as well, or the chat box as your friend. And if not these particular questions, then if you have anything to share about your feedback practices, then I would love to hear about that. Sure, Irene. So looking at the model here on the screen, the model offers different features of how to improve how students take action regarding the feedback they are given. So when you look at the question marks, for me, that points to what is our role as an instructor to facilitate that process. So we say that students should have an appreciation of feedback. Well, what can we do to encourage that process? How encourage students to appreciate the feedback we give them? Or how can we model making judgments about feedback? What do we expect students to do with them? So when we give feedback, what are the thought processes that go on in the instructor's mind? So Alex says, I think it's important to have assignments work with each other to allow students an opportunity to incorporate feedback into the next assignment. Yep, absolutely. I love that. Rash says, request the students to apply what they have learned and the feedback they have been given. Thereafter, the students can report back on their application experience. Yeah, so you're pointing towards that conversation between instructor and student about their learning. Thank you for that.
So I don't know whether that would be an appreciation feedback, but for example, when I complete the bank reconciliation with them, then I tell them that, all right, you can apply that this knowledge in your any sort of entrepreneurship, or even if you're doing your own business, understanding the bank reconciliation will help. Will that be an recognition or appreciation when they complete?
Yeah, I think anytime you're asking students to give examples or even connecting to their experiences, they will learn to appreciate the feedback that way. Is that what you meant? Did I understand you correctly, Kaz?
Or for example, in my finance course, when I complete, when I discuss about a topic, how to calculate the Canadian mortgage payment, and when they complete that assignment, and then some of them, they are really interested to know whether they can apply that in a real life situation. And when they apply and see that results, that it actually matches with the theory and the reality, it's kind of the same.
Yes.
Then so
yeah, that's
will
absolutely. Yep, that's absolutely it. So what you're doing is you're connecting your content to a real world context, and therefore the feedback means even more to the student when they can see that applicability. And
so that is what I'm saying.
Exactly, and that will definitely lead to them appreciating the feedback more. Thank you so much for that example.
No, you're welcome.
And Irene says, Alex and Rash, can you give examples of what you do?
Yeah, I can do that. So I teach a current events course, and I try to do sort of smaller assignments. So what I'll kind of do is take one assignment idea that might have been a little higher stakes that I would do in a more in-person class, and break it up into two assignments, like part 1 and part 2, almost trying to mimic a structure that says assignment 1 is a rough draft, or sorry, like an outline. Assignment 2 is the rough draft. Assignment 3 is the final project. But I'll try to do that with more than just written reports. And so I'll say, assignment 1 and assignment 2 might actually be extremely similar in terms of the skills, but I break them into two specific assignments so they have an opportunity to get feedback.
That's great. I think that's such a good idea. And then what do the students do with that feedback? Are they conversing with you again, or are they taking it and then incorporating it into assignment 2, and then you'll give them feedback again and they'll move forward?
So for the summative, for assessments with grades, it's more of the second one where I'm looking for them to incorporate the feedback. Right. But they're also, some students have reached out for more details, or, how can I incorporate this more? So I'm open to it, but the focus is just on incorporating that feedback into the second assignment.
Thanks so much for that, Alex. That's such a good example, and so applicable to, I think, across contexts as well, just to have mini assignments that lead up to a summative. And so students see the value in each little assignment as well, right? It's not a standalone. Rash says, request the students to apply what they have learned and the feedback they have been given. Yeah, I think I've read that. I use this methodology when I assign my students with team projects. They have check-in milestones. Check-ins are great. Where they receive feedback along the way. Thereafter, they are able to iterate and improve their deliverables throughout the semester. Absolutely. Irene, did you have any more examples to share of your own, or was that helpful? Okay, we'll move on to the next slide, where I think I've tried to give you examples of what the question marks might mean. So in this slide, I've suggested just a few factors that we might think about that describes our role as instructors in terms of valuable feedback. Really picking one or two big ideas to improve sometimes is a lot more helpful than trying to correct every small thing in a student's assignment, which might lead to overwhelm. So you might just say, okay, today I want to look at this particular aspect of student work and look for that as you go and provide detailed feedback on that, improving a little aspect of their learning at a time. Rather than correcting everything and leaving students lost as to what to focus on. And I think assignments that build upon each other are such a great way to do this, because students have an end goal in mind. They know that their learning will look like, they know what they have to display, and they know how to improve that as they go. Also, providing opportunities to practice making judgments about feedback comments is essential. And it's important when paired with modeling how that might be done. So as instructors, we have an idea of what we expect students to do with the feedback, but they might not. And so really just explicitly explaining to them, I've given you this feedback and I would like you to use it this way for the next part of this assignment and other subsequent assignments. We mentioned Adobe Spark earlier, and this is a great resource to explicitly outline these ideas and then have a conversation that way. Now, moving on. Right, and also one way to manage the effect before I move on is to emphasize the purpose of feedback. Really explain to students that the purpose is simply to improve their learning. It's not to judge the work that they are handing in. And managing emotions can be a little bit easier that way. I don't know if you've had an experience of students leaving the classroom upset based on feedback that they've received, but I've experienced it a few times, and really this is such an important part of the model that David Carlos is talking about. And it's not something that we should ignore, but really bring in the skills to work around how we're feeling, why we're feeling it, and I think emphasizing the purpose of the feedback can help with that. So it's not a judgment on them or their work, it's simply feedback to improve their learning and their performance. And finally, let's talk about metacognition, which is viewed as an abstract and complex idea, and therefore it deters engagement, especially in online contexts, as I mentioned earlier. If you are thinking of designing authentic assignments and assessments, then developing strong metacognitive skills as early as possible is important. Some students will find this quite intuitive as a way to approach a new task, whereas others will struggle. So really be on the lookout for this, and I think practice is key here. The question we want to ask is how to facilitate metacognitive practice online, and this inevitably involves the use of technology. And I'll mention just two key frameworks, and then I'd love to hear about how you might do this in your own contexts or your classrooms. So very briefly, the two key frameworks at play here are metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive regulation. And in summary, this involves developing in students the skills of self-awareness, taking stock of the learning strategies that they have used and experienced in the past, and really being able to assess and evaluate which strategies work best in particular situations. So when they are faced with a similar situation or task, they know what to try, evaluate that, and then plan again for the next task. And so essentially, the student has internalized the role of becoming their own teacher and regulate their learning by being aware of and being intentional towards the work that they do. I will try and post some more strategies for this in our shared Padlet, but to provide an idea of the sort of things we can do, I'll draw your attention to a few things. So process checks are one way that we can sort of leverage the process of metacognition. And I think Alex, you gave a great example of what you do in terms of process checks. And It doesn't always have to be between assignments. You can also, within the assignment, check in with students, as Rash mentioned as well. Have a 2-minute conversation to really get behind student thinking about why they're approaching a specific problem, a specific case study in a particular way. So really allow that space and time to think about what they are doing and why they are doing it, take stock of the resources they have, and plan the strategies that they will use to tackle a problem. You can use Google Docs or a similar platform to this. I love using Google Docs as a way for students to annotate their work and highlight their thinking. So they can comment on the sidebar and explain to their instructor, I've done this because. An elaborative interrogation is another way. So really asking how and why questions purposefully, which really prompts students to think deeply about what they are learning and where the gaps in their understanding might be. So I'd love to hear from you at this point and ask you about how you encourage students to think about their own thinking and whether you think that this leads to more sort of empowerment with their own work. Does anyone have any examples of what they do?
I think I have answered, or I have discussed that in our prior discussion, that when I ask my students to create a problem in their own words, that actually helped me to know that how much they are involved in and how much they are aware of the situation and the topic that we are covering. So that might be with the metacognitive knowledge, like because most of my chapters are related to each other. It's not it's not self-independent. Like when they are completing chapter 1, and if they have any sort of lack of understanding or knowledge about chapter 1, they cannot successfully move to or complete the chapter 2. So when they are completing the problems that I assign them, and then when after feedback, when they are again submitting that, by that actually I think they have that analytical ability to know more about what they are up to.
Yeah, and something similar to that. Thanks for sharing that example. I did something similar in my K-12 classroom by creating student self-talk scripts. So these are students who needed a little bit more guidance with metacognitive practice. And so you just offer them a script with prompts for simple questions like, I did this because, I solved a problem this way because, I could have done it this way, but. So when students are answering these questions, it helps them to evaluate the strategies that they've used and whether there could have been different strategies that might have been better. So really just encouraging students to think, and that could come from dialogue between the instructor and the student, especially online. It's more difficult to gauge how they're doing. So there we go. Okay, so that's all I have for today. I'll take any questions you have, and any other resources you want, research papers or more materials, please let me know, and I'll keep posting them on the Padlet for you to refer to as well. So do take a look at that. But are there any questions at this point?
The Padlet link is on our main day 1 page, or?
Scroll to the very top of the chat, you'll find the link, and I will also post it again. There you go, I've posted it again. So you'll find related resources to the 3 topics and more general resources about the science of learning. So you might want to browse that in the next 5 minutes.